Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life. The authors of our textbook believe that their 5 principles can be applied to the subject of taking human lives. You remember their first principle is that human life should be revered and that death should be accepted. The authors of our textbook begin their discussion of the taking of a human life with a discussion of suicide. Suicide is defined as the intentional taking of one's life, and the authors note it is questionable whether suicide is moral or immoral. I want to draw a distinction between suicide and sacrifice. Sacrifice is the intentional giving of oneself for another. This may involve the actual giving of one's life for the benefit of another. And sacrifice is almost always viewed as meritorious, highly moral. For example, in the Bible we read, "Greater love has no man than this, than he lay down his life for his friends." And we think perhaps of a person in a combat situation, a brave soldier who realizes that the only way the squad is going to survive is if I sacrifice my life so that others live. And often when this has happened, the person who makes this choice is given a posthumous Congressional Medal of Honor. We recognize that this person has done something highly honorable, so we give them the Medal of Honor. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about suicide. We're talking about someone taking their life not for the benefit of others, but for some perceived benefit to themselves. Those who argue that suicide is immoral sometimes say that suicide is always irrational. Now, the authors of our textbook point out that this is sometimes the case, but not necessarily is this always the case. For example, in the last year or so, we have had individuals with terminal illnesses who have chosen to take their own life on a day of their own choosing, and they have made their wishes known, their plan known on social media. And the day approached, they had said their farewells to family and to friends, and then, according to their plan, before the symptoms of their terminal illness became unbearable, they took their own life. Now, a person might say that that was an immoral act, but it would be hard to argue that it is an irrational act, because there is certainly a logic behind the action. That terminal patient looks at his or her situation and realizes it's going to be bad for me. I may lose my ability to even have cognitive thought and to be able to communicate with my loved ones. And I don't want to get to that point. And so at a point before then, on a day when I am still able to carry on a cogent conversation, after I have said my final farewells to those I care about, I'm going to end my life before all of those awful symptoms that come with the full development of my disease come upon me. It's a very rational argument. Again, you may not agree with that argument on moral grounds, but you can't really say it's irrational. The primary arguments against suicide are religious. The one that the author gives us here is that only God can create or end human life. And this would be true of God-based religions, but not all religions suppose the existence of a supreme being. You have the Jain religion, for example, you have the Buddhist religion, you have certain other religions that don't believe in a creator God or a personal God. Most of these religions take a negative view of suicide. There is within the Jain religion the allowance for suicide when someone is in old age and they have reached the place where life is no longer worth living. And the Jain religion would allow them to have a planned suicide event, very much like the one I described earlier, that they have said their goodbyes and now they choose to peacefully let their life come to an end. And there are some schools of Buddhist thought that would allow for a similar thing. However, for a young, able-bodied person to take this step would be a step that most religions, including most branches of the Buddhist tree, would be opposed to and would consider, if not an irrational act, then certainly an act of questionable morality. Now, within the Catholic tradition, suicide is a mortal sin. It is a sin for which there is no forgiveness. It is a sin that will win you a one-way ticket to eternal damnation. Protestants are perhaps a little more generous, leaving the final judgment in these matters to God. But most of the world's religions would say that the taking of one's life is questionable, to say the least. The author of our text says, but what about those who are not members of those specific religions? What about a person, for example, who has no religious conviction at all? Should that person's action be limited by another person's religious convictions or beliefs? And the answer to that is, in a practical sense, no one is limited from committing suicide. I suppose if anyone is determined to kill themselves, they can find a way to do it. But I think what we're talking about here is, can a person take their own life? And the culture sanctions that, or at least says this is something that we're not going to judge or condemn. And the author is saying it's fine for people who are religious to perhaps judge people within their own religion who violate the precepts of that particular religious system. But what right would they have to judge someone outside of that system? Fair enough. The next argument that the author makes is that the religious condemnation of suicide is theologically questionable. And that would perhaps be somewhat true in the modern era. We live in a day and age in which the traditional teaching of the Christian religion, the Jewish faith, and to a certain extent other religious systems as well, is being questioned, both by those outside of the religion who are challenging the prevailing religion of a culture, and also from some within who do not like the traditional teaching of the religion. This being said, the theological questions are being raised by those who want to change the religious tradition. Because if you look at the traditions themselves and the historical basis for the particular religion in question's views on these subjects, the history of the theology of these religions is certainly on the side of those who would say that suicide is something that should not be done. The final argument that the author makes is if we say that suicide is wrong, this removes human responsibility. And this is really an interesting argument. And the author will use it in a number of cases as we go into the second half of the textbook. The traditional understanding of human responsibility is that you obey the rules, and if you disobey the rules, then you take responsibility for your sin. The author kind of turns that around, turns it on its head. And it's the idea that flows out of his freedom principle that everyone is free to decide for themselves on all moral issues as long as they subscribe to the four basic principles or almost absolutes that the author outlined in his moral system. So the idea is they're basically good people, and the taking or losing of their life is one of those areas where people ought to be able to choose for themselves, and everyone ought to accept that choice of lifestyle or the choice to end a lifestyle without condemning that person for their autonomous choice. And so the author says if you say that people should not commit suicide, that this is something our society should frown upon, then you are saying that I cannot be free to make my own decisions as to when my life ends. And in doing that, you are taking away my human responsibility. It's an interesting argument, but in order for this argument to be valid, you have to first accept Principle 5, the author's freedom principle. And once you have accepted that, then it follows that, yeah, this would be one of those areas where a person ought to choose for themselves, because we revere life, but we accept death. And with the freedom principle, we accept a person's right to be the master of their fate and the captain of their soul. Another argument against the morality of suicide is the domino argument. This argument states that if suicide is allowed, other forms of murder, or the taking of human life, will follow. And the author notes that this argument is worthy of consideration, but they fall back on their tried and true argument. There is no conclusive evidence to support it. This argument, I think, was articulated best by Pope John Paul II and carried forward then by Pope Benedict, the idea that we are creating a culture of death, that as we say it is okay to kill this person or for this person to take their life under this set of circumstances, we have placed ourselves on a slippery slope. And unfortunately, history has shown us that once society begins to approve of the taking of human life, it doesn't know when to quit. Let me give you an extreme example. Let's say that we revive gladiatorial combat, and the people involved know that they're going to be fighting to the death, and they do this willingly because they think they're tough enough to win, and there's great financial reward for them if they do. And so we bring back gladiatorial combat. And those who die have done so willingly. They have sacrificed their life, not for the sake of others, unless you consider entertaining others to be for the sake of others, but is really kind of a legalized murder carried out with the sanction, or at least the state allows it to be carried out, and who is hurt by it. They are, after all, consenting adults. And if we buy the idea that life and death is a personal choice, that we can be the captain of our fates, the master of our soul, what is the harm in bringing back gladiatorial combat? Some people would enjoy the spectacle, others won't. They can turn the station. They don't have to go to the arena to watch the event. But who are they to judge another person's lifestyle choice if someone just happens to enjoy watching people kill each other? And certainly the participants in this are the masters of their fate and the captain of their soul. So what's the problem? Well, the argument is that you have created a culture, as did the ancient Romans, in which life is devalued and life becomes more and more coarse. We, as a society, just don't know when to quit. Now, someone would counter, but the author's first principle here is to revere life. But there is a conflict here between the autonomy of the individual, the freedom of the individual to choose his own way, including to choose the time of his death, and the value of life principle. And though Pope John Paul II did not use the illustration I have just used, the point is the same. A society first accepts, the Pope would argue, the logic of abortion. The logic of abortion leads quickly to the logic of assisted suicide and the logic of euthanasia, both active and passive. And we end up in the end with mercy killing, and who knows where we go from there. The author says this argument is worthy of consideration, and no conclusive evidence of it. And yet I think a historic case can be made for the fact that the more comfortable a society becomes with death, the more excuses, if you will, the society is going to find for allowing it. There's another domino argument that isn't talked about in our textbook, but I'm bringing in here my own experience. As I mentioned in the syllabus of this course, before I became a humanities teacher, I spent 40 years of my life as a Christian minister. And in this time, I performed a lot of funerals, and I had the misfortune of having to preside at funerals of people who had committed suicide, and I've had to deal with the after effect of that. And this is where the justice argument comes into play, and also the domino argument. First of all, the domino argument. Everyone, I suppose, has had the thought of suicide cross their mind, and some are considering it. I'm always aware in teaching this unit that there may be students in my classroom who are thinking about suicide, and it has been my observation, though I cannot conclusively prove it, that one successful suicide will lead to several more attempts. For example, a number of years ago, we had a suicide on campus, and I hesitated to teach this unit because of my experience as a minister. I believed that there would be additional attempts, and in fact there were. Fortunately, none of these other attempts were successful, and the individuals who tried to kill themselves are still alive, and they've worked through the temporary issues that were prompting them to seek a permanent solution. But it seems as though when one person does it, others who are contemplating it sometimes decide that they're going to do it too. Again, I can't prove that conclusively, but it's been an observation, and it ties into the justice argument. It's been said that if you really want to hurt everyone who has ever loved or cared about you, killing yourself is a good way of doing that. And a lot of people are going to be devastated by what the person who kills themselves does. Now, you could argue in the case of a person that's made the arrangements, said their goodbyes, and everyone is on board with it, that that would not happen. And okay, I will grant you that. But generally, that is not how suicide occurs. And most people are shocked when they hear that a friend or a loved one has killed themselves. Again, a few years ago in class, I was teaching, and I got a phone call, and I normally don't answer my phone, but they just kept calling. And so I picked it up, and it turned out a friend of mine had killed themselves and himself. And, it just stuns you, surprises you, and you begin to immediately ask yourself, what could I have done? Why didn't I see this coming? Why didn't I reach out? And for family, for friends, they find themselves victims of this person's violent act against their own life. And what I'm suggesting here is that suicide is not a victimless crime. And a person may think, well, it doesn't matter. No one cares about me. And, I've struggled with depression myself through the years, and I know there is a logic there. Everybody hates me. Nobody likes me. Guess I'll eat some worms. But the fact is, there are a lot of people that care about us. Parents, spouse, children, friends. The list goes on and on. And all these people are going to be impacted, and many of them are going to be wounded by that person that takes their own life. And some of the wounds are going to be so deep that the person hurt will never be able to get over them. They will be carrying a pain, an unresolved set of issues throughout the rest of their life. So the person who kills himself says, my pain's over. But this act of suicide may result in an unfair, lasting pain on someone else that will not go away, that cannot be cured. Suicide is not a victimless crime. And having been there, having on occasion as a minister been called upon to help people who were the victims of the suicide go on with their lives, I understand the justice argument very well. And I would say that it is never fair to the survivors of, the author says, the victim. I think a more accurate term would be the perpetrator, because in suicide, the perpetrator and the victim are one and the same, but the perpetrator has more than one victim, though they may not realize it. We turn now to the arguments for the morality of suicide. The authors refer to their freedom principle here, and they give the argument that a person has a right over his or her own body and life. A person then should have the freedom to make decisions concerning his or her own body and life. And it is entirely up to the individual human being to decide whether their own life is worth living. This is the logic that the author is going to use to argue a number of different issues here in the second half of our textbook, rooted strongly in his freedom principle, that as long as a person is a fairly good person as defined by the four basic principles, then they are the captain of their fate, they are the master of their soul. We talked in an earlier lecture about the who says so problem. We referenced Friedrich Nietzsche, and he pointed out that if God is dead, someone is going to have to take his place. And every secular moral system then has to say, whether directly or not, who God is going to be. They have rejected the idea of the Judeo-Christian God, or they have rejected perhaps the Eastern idea of some moral force that exists throughout the entire emanation that is creation or the cosmos. So what's going to take the place of that? And in the author's system, you get to be God. For societal purposes, so that we can have a working society, we have four basic principles. Everything else you get to be the master of your fate, the captain of your own soul, your own lawgiver. And based on that, you have a right over your own body and your own life. You should be able to make decisions concerning your own body or life. It's entirely up to you. But when we're talking about the taking of a human life, we're not talking about a tattoo here. And if my actions affect others, if my actions can do permanent damage to another, then I want to suggest that maybe my own individual autonomy or independence My ability to make my own choices needs to be tempered by the fact that what I choose to do may impact someone else. And the counter argument to the argument the author presents here is the argument I gave, the last argument against suicide, that suicide is not a victimless crime. There is in suicide more than one victim, in fact. And so, might it be moral to think that my individual liberty should end at that point when my individual liberty begins to inflict harm upon another? The authors note this argument, in a sense, when they ask the question, does anyone have an absolute right over his or her body, over his or her life? And they're making the same point. It's my body. If I want to use my body to drive my fist, which is part of my body, into your nose, should I not have a right to do that? And the argument is no, because that other person has a right not to have his or her nose broken. So I obviously cannot do anything I would like to do with my body, because what I do with my body might result in injury to another. And how about my life? And again, if there were no victims, if suicide hurt nobody, then this particular justice argument would not have much force. But since suicide does impact others, perhaps the morality of the question is a little more complicated than this particular argument allows for. I want to mention here, we're going to talk about medically assisted suicide and that sort of thing in another chapter. What we're focusing on right here is plain out, old-fashioned, life isn't worth living, I've decided I'm going to kill myself. That kind of suicide. The authors of our textbook also discuss the subject of killing to protect the innocent, including yourself, the right of self-defense. And they opine that it is questionable whether killing someone in defense of the innocent, including yourself, is moral or immoral. Now, it might strike you as a little odd that anyone would say that you should not have the right to defend yourself, or that a police officer, for example, does not have a right to use deadly force to protect innocent people from a murder. We'd say, of course they do. We hope they would. If someone is trying to kill me and there's a police officer there and he says, stop, and that person continues heading at me with his machete, we would hope that the police officer would take that person out. And if the person is killed as a result of that bullet flying through them, that the police officer would not be held guilty of any crime because he was protecting an innocent person. But there are those who would argue that it is always wrong to take a human life. The author argues that this doesn't recognize the complexities of human existence, or that some human beings are capable of violating all moral principles. I ran into such a person. Years ago, I was a high school mock trial coach, and one of the young women I coached, when she went her way, graduated from high school, she became a Buddhist, and she married a Buddhist man, and she became a complete pacifist as a result of her Buddhism. And she was a Facebook friend, and this subject came up in one of those Facebook debates as to whether someone had a right to take someone's life in self-defense. And so I decided to test her theory. She was arguing that it is always wrong to take a human life no matter what. And so I asked her, what would you do if someone was trying to rape you? And she came back and said, I have actually had that experience. And I said, oh boy, me and my big mouth, or I guess it would be my big fat fingers, since we were typing this all out online. But I had to admit, she had me. She was completely consistent with her principle. After trying to get my foot out of my mouth or my hands out of my mouth, whatever the offending appendages happen to be, I ask her, well, what about your next door neighbor? If someone's trying to kill your next door neighbor, she says, I would try to prevent it. I would use whatever force I could. But if I actually ended up taking that person's life, I would consider that a moral wrong. And I had to appreciate her consistency, and from her own experience that she lived by her principle. But most people would grant a right to self-defense. And certainly most people would say that the police officer doing his duty, using deadly force to protect an innocent person, has not committed a moral crime. The argument in favor of sometimes doing this, you're defending the innocent, you have a right and even an obligation to protect innocent life, even your own. It is morally reprehensible, according to this argument, for a person to stand by and watch someone murder their neighbor without lifting a hand to prevent it. And again, my Buddhist friend argued that you, of course, should try to protect that innocent life. But this does not mean you have a license to kill to do it. There are, of course, some strains of Buddhist thought that would not go to this extreme and would understand a right to use deadly force if necessary to protect the innocent. But my particular friend had her beliefs. The argument for self-defense and for protecting the innocent would also argue that the good of defending the innocent outweighs the bad of killing a murderer of innocent people. This is a bit of a utilitarian argument that, the ledger sheet. Yeah, it's not good to kill. It goes against the author's reverence of life principles. But on the other hand, you are saving more lives by taking out the one. And so the good outweighs the bad. And then you have, again, the Pope's culture of death argument, that violence breeds violence, and that if you allow the killer to go unpunished, then you are sending the message that our culture is not serious about protecting innocent life. And what is this going to result in except increased violence and more killing? The next subject the authors of our textbook address in their discussion of the taking of human life is the question of war. And of course, it is very questionable whether war is moral or immoral. And they begin with the arguments against war. They point out that war is obviously a direct and massive violation of the value of life principle, and this would be especially so when nuclear weapons are used. A society might say, we revere human life, and yet if that society goes to war, it doesn't look like they revere the lives of those people they are warring against. Just the opposite. Life becomes very cheap in war. And the authors note that war causes a great deal of useless killing, especially innocent non-combatants. I want to point out that this would be especially true in modern warfare. We have a nice euphemism for it. We call it collateral damage. And collateral damage is, okay, we were trying to get those people we consider the bad guys, and the process of killing the bad guys, a lot of people that were not bad guys. So we're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ended up getting killed too. But that's the way it is in war. And the author raises the question, yeah, but is that right? Given the fact that massive numbers of people are killed in modern warfare, and that would be especially so if nuclear weapons were used. Think of what was accomplished with just two of these devices at the end of the Second World War in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Man, that's a lot of killing. Innocent non-combatants. Is that morally justifiable? And those who would be pacifists would say, certainly not under any circumstances. Those who would believe that war is intrinsically immoral would go on to argue that the destruction caused by war far outweighs the gain. Certainly you could argue we gain certain things by fighting this war. But the pacifist would look and say, yeah, but at what cost? And how can you morally justify the cost of this war? So the pacifist would suggest that we need to deal with aggression and violence through peaceful means. And we need to pacify one's enemies through nonviolence. And they might look to the example of a Mahatma Gandhi. However, those who would say that war is sometimes necessary would point out that Mahatma Gandhi acknowledged that his methods worked against the Brits, but they would not have worked against the Nazis. So the question is raised, is it not true that there are some people that will not be pacified? And the consistent pacifist would say, yes, and it is better to live in a nonviolent way, even under the rule of a tyrant, rather than to resort to armed conflict. I mentioned my Buddhist friend when we were talking about self-defense, and she would surely take this position. There are counter-arguments. Some people would say that war is the best controller of opioid population. You know, when I read that in the textbook, I wondered, is he serious? I have never heard anyone argue this. I suppose you might find someone that was a true hater of the human race who would say we have too many people in war, would get rid of a whole bunch of them. I haven't personally read the writing of that person. I'm not aware of that argument. So I wonder if that's tongue-in-cheek. Here's another one. It's the mother of invention. Well, it is a fact that all sorts of technologies that have peaceful applications had a jump start, at least, as a result of war. The airplane, for example, existed before the First World War, but as there was a need to fight this war and a desire to win this war, aviation technology took a huge step forward as a result of the war, and all sorts of other inventions and devices came online. They have wonderful civilian applications today, but many of these things were invented because we were looking for better ways of killing one another. That is a fact. I again cannot imagine someone arguing, we need to declare war on this nation because it's going to spur invention in this country. I think that's a little ridiculous. Surely no one argues that. Here's one. It's a great unifying factor and an economic boon to individual nations. Well, militarization will certainly do that. We look at the example of the Third Reich, for example, and their economy. All the economies of the world were in the tank as a result of the Great Depression, which hit all over the world. But Germany pulled out of that before the other nations of the world because they rearmed, and everyone got to work and everyone had a job. Now they were doing it on credit, and there might have been a payday for that down the line. But at the time, they were talking about the German economic miracle. Everyone else was still in the Great Depression, and Germany had pulled out of it. Everyone was working. One of the attractions of fascism was it seemed to work. It was being called the middle ground between communism and capitalism, and being held out by many intellectuals in academia throughout the world, including the United States of America, as perhaps the way we ought to go. Of course, the rearming was being done in secret, and Churchill and others were warning against what was really going on, which was behind the boom. But if you step back, say, yeah, but it worked. When they started making weapons, they started rebuilding their army. It was good for the economy. And of course, you have the Nuremberg rallies. It unified the people of Germany behind a great cause. Uh, yeah, but I don't know that I've heard anyone argue, we ought to go to war here because our country is very divided, which it is, and the economy is kind of anemic. Actually, it's getting better as I record this lecture, but yeah, let's say we need to get the economy moving, and so let's go to war. And everyone will pull together. We'll write songs about how great it is to send our soldiers over there. The economy will boom. Yeah, some people are going to die, but who argues this? This is the argument that actually exists. War is sometimes a necessary evil. There is such thing as a morally just war. Now, I like the term necessary evil in discussing this because in it there is an acknowledgement that war is evil. There is nothing good about war. But given the realities of the world we live in, sometimes what choice do we have? For example, going back to the Third Reich, Hitler's Reich had a program of genocide. Had they won, they would have eradicated not just the Jewish people, but all other sorts of peoples that they considered to be subhuman. Now, the pacifist would say we need to appease. Well, that was tried. Britain and France had a deliberate, what they called, policy of appeasement. But all they gave to the hungry bear to try to keep that bear at peace just made the bear more hungry and more aggressive. It didn't work. What are you going to do? The pacifists would say submit, live under the tyrant. And then we have the situation where our neighbors are being hauled away to death camps because they happen to be Slavs or Gypsies or Jews. Or does there come a time when we have to resort to war, though war is always a terrible thing? What about that war of self-defense? Someone is invading your country. Does your country then have a moral justification for resisting that armed aggression? If a police force within a nation is justifiable to protect us from those who would prey upon the innocent from within, would not a self-defense war be morally justifiable to protect the people from those who would prey upon it from without? Police officers dressed in a blue uniform, and he protects the people against domestic threats. Soldiers dressed in a cami uniform to protect people from threats from without. Why is the one morally justifiable and the other not? Police officers sometimes have to take life. That's a bad thing, but it's a necessary evil. And the argument would be that soldiers sometimes have to take lives. Matter of fact, that's why we have armies, is to kill people and break things. But sometimes we have no other choice. When we talk about war, we also have to talk about weapons of mass destruction, nuclear war. And the authors of our textbook state that the devastation possible in a nuclear conflict is such that most arguments, including the just war argument, cannot support a nuclear holocaust. They opine that such a war is indefensible. The greatest generation, the generation that fought and won the Second World War, is pretty much gone. There are people that are approaching the century mark that served in that conflict, but that generation is almost passed into history. And if you would talk to someone from that generation, you would discover that they believed that the use of atomic weapons to end the Second World War was completely justifiable. My own father was one of these. He was on Okinawa, which was a bloody conflict. And it is estimated that we would have lost millions of people had we then invaded Japan, and the Japanese would have lost more. And the argument is often made that the firebombing of Tokyo was much more devastating than nuclear blasts at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's a tough question. I like to talk about this in class with my students. Might make a good discussion board sometime. Is that decision, the decision that was made by President Truman to use nuclear weapons, is it morally justifiable? The author of our textbook says it's indefensible. Well, for those who would have had to invade Japan, they would have another point of view. What do you think? One of the disadvantages of a class like this is I can't get your feedback on that. But it's an interesting question, isn't it? That's one of the things that makes the study of ethics interesting, is it raises some interesting dilemmas and questions. What about war? What about weapons of mass destruction? After the First World War, it was decided that we should not have chemical weapons anymore. As I record this lecture, our country has just warned the government of Syria that they better not use chemical weapons again, or our country will retaliate militarily. Now, under our new administration, the Trump administration, we did it once. And now Russia, Iran, and Syria have been told don't do it again. The world has often said that they're against chemical weapons. There are all sorts of international treaties against it. But until recently, that has not been enforced. Now, we have an administration that is enforcing it. It raises all sorts of moral questions. There's a Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. We live in very interesting times. Another subject we want to consider in this chapter is the subject of terrorism. Terrorism is an old and a very destructive method of making war. By definition, it is war deliberately waged against civilians. And according to the just war theory, this is intrinsically evil, never justifiable. We are somewhat comfortable, maybe we shouldn't be, but we have become comfortable with the idea of collateral damage. But the idea of collateral damage is we weren't trying to kill a bunch of civilians. We were trying to kill a bad guy or a group of bad guys, and civilians just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. We feel bad about that, but we weren't trying to kill them. We weren't deliberately targeting them. But terrorism is, I am going to go after the civilians because I cannot go toe-to-toe against the military. Now, one of the most difficult aspects of terrorism is obviously it causes injury and death, hundreds, even thousands of innocent people. And it often results in the massive destruction of property. We had a painful example of this in the United States of America, 9/11, when the Twin Towers came down. Billions of dollars worth of damage, thousands of people. That is terrorism with its most angry face. The arguments in favor are these. When people are oppressed, they're angry about their lot and life, and non-violent means haven't worked for them, they feel they must resort to violence. Innocents may be killed, but the terrorist cause is more important than the lives of those innocents. You know, this is really only partially what terrorists would say in defense of their position. They would not always argue that they're oppressed and angry. Now, someone, say a Palestinian terrorist, might make that argument, but some are driven by ideology. Some of them have had a very good life. Osama bin Laden, for example, grew up in a wealthy home. His family was rich. So what was his beef? He was driven by an ideology. And sometimes in our modern worlds, particularly in the West, we underestimate the power of ideology. We underestimate the force of religious passion. On the Marxist model, we tend to try to explain everything in terms of economics. And the Marxist paradigm of the people with the power oppressing those without the power. I would argue that that is reductionist. Certainly that is a factor, and many people are driven by the feeling that they are impressed or out of anger over their lot in life. But many people are trying to advance a noble cause to gain a just end, or what they perceive to be a just end. And they're not really being driven by the things that we would like to say they're being driven by. But the second point, the cause is more important. And a true terrorist would argue people are not necessarily innocent just because they're civilians. It's a civilian population, for example, that makes it possible for the state then to carry out its aggression, its actions against the cause. And so often the killing of, quote, innocents is justified with the argument that people that are supportive of an oppressive regime cannot be considered truly innocent. Arguments against terrorism, excessive violence, especially when it involves the loss or mutilation, loss of lives of innocent people, can't be condoned. And it doesn't fall under any morally just war theory. But the terrorist would argue there is a double standard at play here. There is an us versus them mentality. The people with the power, and here comes the Marxist paradigm, do the same thing. They can justify it by saying we are a powerful nation state. But when those who do not have that power do the same thing, it's called terrorism. Here's a better way of explaining this, I suppose. One man's terrorist, so the saying goes, is another man's freedom fighter. You, the terrorist, would say, the United States, have someone you want to get. He's attending a wedding in Pakistan. One of your drones sends in a Hellfire missile, blows up that man you're after. But the wedding party's taken out too, and hundreds are injured. And you call that collateral damage, and you justify it by saying we have good cause. This man is a wanted terrorist. Feel bad about all those civilian casualties. We then come and we use a car bomb, and it kills the same number of people. Why is our action terror and yours not? Well, it's us versus them. But what makes the fact that you are part of a powerful, just nation, what makes your nation's actions in firing that Hellfire missile into a wedding justifiable, while our actions are not? And they would argue you have a double standard. Now, interestingly, in my classes, I have had a number of students from different parts of the world. And a few years ago, I had a young woman in my class who was from Kenya. Friends of hers, classmates of hers from high school, were attending a school that was hit by terrorists from Somalia. And boy, she didn't like this part of the chapter. She wanted to write her paper. We had term papers on this chapter. And she made a strong argument that, we did nothing wrong. You can argue this case if you're talking about something, the United States and all their great military power, but what did we in Kenya do to deserve this? You would argue that you have poverty and you're angry about your lot in life. We have that too, but we're not going over to Somalia and blowing up people and killing people. And she made the case that all of this argument in favor of terrorism is just a smokescreen, hiding the fact that this is just applied hate. Interesting perspective from someone who has seen a part of the world and a dark side of the world that fortunately most of us have not had to see. We come now to capital punishment, another one of those areas of great controversy in our time. Capital punishment is the death penalty. Capital crime is a crime for which people are put to death, depending on the time in history or the place, the country, the culture. The capital punishment has been used against murderers, those who kidnap, those who rape, those who torture. We go back to the theories of punishment we've discussed earlier in the course. The retributivist, or the just deserts theory, would say that yes, punishment such as this can be allowed, but only if it's deserved, and only to the extent that it is deserved. For instance, you might have several people involved in the murder of someone, but one person is really the active player. The others are there. They could have interfered. They didn't. They are viewed as accessories. We would not necessarily, in this theory, the retributivist theory, say that all of them should be put to death, but the person responsible primarily should be put to death, and the others would be given the sentence that they deserve based on their involvement in the crime. The utilitarian theory would also allow for the possibility of capital punishment if it could be shown that it will bring about good consequences for everyone concerned. And so we often hear discussions of deterrence, whether or not capital punishment is a deterrent. When this is being talked about, you know that you're involved in a discussion with a utilitarian, because a utilitarian would take the position, if it deters crime, we can justify it. But if not, then we should look for some other form of punishment, because punishment should result in the greatest good for the greatest number of people possible, everyone affected by the act. The restitution or compensation theory would also say that, I suppose, it would bring about good consequences for everyone. But, the authors say it fits. I would say only in this sense. You're really kind of making restitution just deserts here. That the taking of the life of the murderer compensates the victims of that murderer's crime. And so it brings about good consequences. Kind of a blend of the two arguments here. It's one of those things when I read the textbook and teach this course, one of those areas where I say, I'd sure like to sit down with the authors of the textbook and discuss this further. But the authors of our textbook do say that capital punishment could conceivably be accepted by all of the theories of justice that we've discussed in this course. The arguments against capital punishment are these. First, it's a violation of the value of life principle that the authors have enunciated. And this argument would be that capital punishment is murder, planned and executed by society. Now, those in favor of capital punishment would say not all intentional taking of life is murder, Murder, by definition, according to those who are okay with capital punishment, murder would be the intentional taking of an innocent human life with malice and forethought. Capital punishment would be the intentional taking of a guilty human being's life without malice after due process with forethought. So they would say it doesn't really fit the definition of murder, and it's just a gunpowder word you're using here to inflame passions. Another argument against capital punishment would be this: it doesn't bring back the killer's victims. It's perhaps vengeance, perhaps recompense to the survivors of the victim. Well, what's wrong with vengeance? Now you might say, well, that's obvious. It's not right to get revenge. Who says? Bringing in the who says so problem. Perhaps we would not agree to live under a social contract were it not for the fact that we believe that the state is going to execute vengeance. I am not going to do it myself. I'm not going to be a vigilante. But the state is going to pay back those who victimize me. So I don't have to. It seems like there is an assumption here that vengeance or revenge is wrong. But why so? Shouldn't we discuss that? And then the authors fall back on their conclusive proof argument. Boy, that is a handy argument for them. There's no conclusive proof that it is a deterrent. And the argument is, well, Ted Bundy killed at least 30 plus women. And after he was put to death, he never did it again, so it deterred him. That, of course, is a little bit of a facetious argument. But the person who is a retributivist would say we're not really concerned about deterrence. We're concerned about serving justice. And the utilitarian would say there is no abstract concept of justice that must be served. The rules of society are the rules that have been devised for society. And if a punishment is going to be inflicted, it must be shown that that punishment somehow benefits the society. And if there is no deterrent value, then what good is it? Another argument against capital punishment is that it's possible to execute an innocent person. That's certainly possible. Some would say, I can see that argument. Why don't we just have a higher standard of proof then for capital crimes? For other crimes, the standard is proof beyond all reasonable doubt. Perhaps before we take the life of a human being, it should be proof beyond all question, beyond all doubt. Perhaps that can be proposed as an answer and a solution to the objection that we could end up killing the wrong person. Another argument is rich who can afford good lawyers usually get lesser sentences, and it's the poor and members of minority races that end up on death row. That isn't always the case, but there's some power to this argument. We have an attorney-driven justice system. If you can afford a really good attorney, things are going to go better for you than if you end up with a public defender or a court-appointed attorney. And so there is an argument that justice is uneven. You could also argue that it differs from state to state. You can kill someone in some states, and depending on the circumstances, the sentence, you might be out in 7 years. You do the same thing in Texas, as comedian Ron White says, we're going to kill you. We got an express lane. So the uneven way in which the death penalty is applied throughout the nation is an argument that has been made against capital punishment. And the argument is also made that it eliminates any possibility of rehabilitation. Well, those who are retributivists would say we're not worried about rehabilitating the criminal. we're intent on seeing to it that justice is done. Related to this is it costs a lot to keep the killer alive, adds cost to the victim's life, and who's going to have to pay those costs? That argument goes both ways. Some say it costs more. People argue, well, yeah, that's because there are so many appeals, and we have to keep them alive so long. If we had it like in the Old West, we have the trial, we take them out and hang them if they're guilty. What cost? The cost of the gallows. But certainly in our modern system, there is an appeals process. A person may not have had good lawyers for his criminal trial, but he's going to have a good lawyer from that point on. And, it's argued that capital punishment is more costly than keeping the person in prison because of all of that stuff. The cost-benefit argument would be something, again, that would be more interesting, I suppose, to a utilitarian than a retributivist. Arguments in favor of capital punishment, one I just mentioned, it certainly deters the killer. Bundy never killed again, so he was deterred. And it may not be able to, we may not be able to show it conclusively, but it stands to reason that if a sentence is carried out quickly, it might deter others who are contemplating murder, because the threat of punishment is something that it does deter us. I drive the speed limit in school zones because I don't want a ticket. And I know others who have received tickets. And if I know there's a place, not just a school zone, but if I know there's a speed trap, the fact that I know others who have had to pay tickets is going to cause me to slow down when I'm in that zone. So conclusive proof, maybe not, but it stands to reason. The argument is if you do it quickly, capital punishment is less costly than imprisonment. There's no reason to make innocent, hardworking taxpayers pay for the upkeep of a guilty killer. Again, the other side of that argument is, well, the legal process, the appeals and everything, fighting capital punishment, it would be cheaper just to keep the person in prison than go through all that rigmarole. I don't know on that one. The other is it puts teeth in the laws, really sharp teeth, and gives them force and sanction, and it encourages obedience. If I know that this might cost me my life, there is a good chance that I might think twice before I commit the crime. There's another argument. A person who has killed someone, has forfeited his right to life. And therefore, taking that person's life is not immoral. Rehabilitation is infeasible, especially when you're talking about psychopaths, serial killers, mutilating killers, and so forth. And finally, it's only fair or just that a person who takes another person's life pay for that with their own. So those are the arguments for and against capital punishment. And those are the major subjects covered in Chapter 9.